the US court determined that Marie had been deliberately shelled by President Assad's forces, i.e. she was actually murdered. And,
so she was murdered for being a reporter.
She was murdered for telling the truth about what was going on in Homs.
So Sarah, tell us about Marie, first of all. What was she like to work with? What sort of person was she like? What sort of journalist was she like?
She was amazingly inspirational, particularly to young women journalists, because she was a star in a field that was dominated by men when she began her life as a war correspondent. This was a tough job. It meant going into very dangerous places, often without support. We're much better today, though not good enough at trying to support journalists. But she, I actually knew her before I joined the Sunday Times. I'd see her byline. She was this extraordinary brunette with kind of corkscrew hair who, used to appear on the page writing about interviewing, Muammar Gaddafi or Yasser Arafat and all these sort of important people in the Middle East. And I'd admire her so much. And then, obviously, I joined the Sunday Times and got to know her and, began to understand more what made her tick. And it wasn't actually about meeting the leaders. It was about reporting on the ordinary people caught up in wars, the sort of real humanity behind the stories that we heard. We'd hear the headlines, but she wrote about the real people who are affected by what's going on in the world. And that too, I found so admirable.
Did you worry about her? Because the stories around her were that she probably didn't take enough. She took too many chances. She pursued the story too much. She tried to speak to people without proper thought for her own safety. Was that a worry for you guys even at the beginning?
Yes, it was. I think we were always concerned about Marie because we knew that as tough as editors can be at national newspapers, she was hardest on herself. She would take risks because she really believed in reporting, on bearing witness. She talked a lot about the power of bearing witness. She used to say that she had the best job in the world because she felt she really could make a difference. And in fact, she did often, time and again. I mean, one outstanding example that she was so proud of was came in East Timor, which was being besieged by Indonesian forces. And she was at a UN compound full of about 1,500 women and children. And the UN gave the order to evacuate, and all the men left. And she and another female reporter stayed behind saying, no, we're not going to leave. And she literally shamed the UN into staying behind and protecting those people. And later she was asked, what about the guys who left? She said, well, I guess they don't make men like they used to. But of course we worried. Of course, everybody who knew and loved Marie worried about her. And it took her a long time to acknowledge, I think much later in life, several years after she was injured in the eye from a rocket-propelled grenade in Sri Lanka, she finally came to terms with the fact that she did have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And she didn't really want to admit it, because one of the things that I think a lot of journalists have difficulty contending with is when they go and report on tremendous human suffering, they don't like to complain about themselves or think about themselves. And it does exact a toll. I mean, I'm sure she would be in Ukraine today were she alive. And we see reporters there taking extraordinary risks and braving all kinds of horrendous conditions to tell the stories of people whose suffering is far greater than their own. But I think we really do need to recognize that risk.
Do you remember where you were when you found out she died?
I do. I was at home, and when the news came through, and I heard it first on the radio, and I was, just profoundly shocked. I actually was editor of the Sunday Times magazine. We had a launch party in early February 2012 at the Saatchi Gallery, where Marie turned up looking fabulous and glamorous and, in a cocktail dress with an eye patch. And for me, And for a lot of other people, that was the last we saw Marie. Even a lot of her closest friends, that's the last we saw Marie. And because 2 weeks later, she was in these terrible conditions in Homs, Syria, getting bombarded by President Assad's forces. And, you know, that was Marie, actually. Her friends used to say she was such a mixture of guts and glamour because, and I sort of sometimes, when I think of her with her sort of rhinestone eye patch coming to that party. And then I think of her sharing all this hardship of the people caught in this brutal civil war in Syria, in Homs. And, you know, she was encouraged to leave Homs, and she really should have, because, you know, the war had really escalated to a dreadful situation there. But she wouldn't leave. In fact, she went back, having initially pulled out, and she went back saying, no, I've got to be there. And, you know, that cost her her life. Her family, she's got a very brave sister called Kat Colvin, who took the Syrian government to court in the US courts and found that Marie, and the US court determined that Marie had been deliberately shelled by President Assad's forces, i.e. she was actually murdered. And, you know, she was murdered for telling the truth about what was going on in Homs. And Kat and her lawyers assembled extraordinary evidence on the ground from people at grave risk to bring that verdict to a US court. So, you know, we know in Marie's case that the current leader of Syria, Bashar Assad, is a war criminal. And just on what he did to Marie alone, but of course he's caused hundreds of thousands of deaths in Syria.